Today's episode is sponsored by Rev, the productivity powerhouse for content creators, journalists, market researchers, and more. Capture audio from anywhere, get AI-powered summaries and quotes, and leave security worries behind with Rev. Whether you're on the go or in the office, Rev's got you covered. Discover more at rev.com. I'm Kendall Kelton, and I'm your host today on The Rough Draft. Featuring honest conversations with folks from across the creative industry, The Rough Draft explores the creative process, tools, and resources used by some of the best in the business. From journalists to content creators and business leaders, we shed light on what it looks like to break into the industry, make mistakes, collaborate with others, and also the essential tools that help us along the way. This week, I'm excited to welcome Peter Balonon-Rosen, a producer for Vox's daily news podcast, Today Explained. With a rich background in audio journalism, Peter has worked across several acclaimed podcasts, including Throughline at NPR and shows at Marketplace like The Uncertain Hour and This Is Uncomfortable. A veteran in the field, his passion is for storytelling about inequality, culture, and policy, and his work has been recognized with numerous awards. On today's episode, Peter tells us about making a deeply personal story about grief, friendship, and the complex role of money in our lives. All right, so I want to now talk about an audio piece, Peter, that you made that is really personal, I think, to you. And also for me, I felt it was a really great listen. When you worked at Marketplace, you produced and hosted an episode of This Is Uncomfortable called What Dad Left Behind. And the podcast itself kind of explores this blend of emotions around money. And so I want you to tell us a bit more about this particular episode and how it came to life.
Yeah. So the show that we worked on, the tagline was Life and How Money Messes with It. And so we were thinking about all the different ways that kind of money, wealth, and class impact people's identities, impacts their relationships, impacts how they move through the world. And at the time, I was telling my roommate about this podcast that I was working on. And he had recently lost his dad. And he was talking about these conflicted feelings he was having about having an inheritance that happened as a result. And he was saying, hey, I would listen to that story because I'm dealing with this. You should find a way to do that. And I was like, okay, that's great. You know, I love getting ideas from talking to people in my life about kind of the things that they're interested in or they're going through. So I did some poking around to try and find some sources for this idea. And I just couldn't really find, there was a lot of kind of people who were experts who could talk about what happens when grief and money mixes. But I think what I was really looking for was someone who could kind of tell about their personal experience and really talk about kind of the complicated feelings that happen as a result. So I went back to my friend Dean, my roommate, and I was like, hey dude, what if we did that story that you were interested in, but we did it about you and what you're going through? And very graciously, he was game. And it was probably one of the most challenging, most intimate reporting projects I've ever been a part of, because I lived with him, first of all. So that really kind of blurred a lot of the source journalist boundaries. He was one of my very best friends, is one of my very best friends. And so we had 10 years of pre-interviews and getting to know each other, which you don't often get with a source, which I feel really made it intimate, but it also made it challenging because we were all of a sudden going to be talking about things we had never really talked about before. And so what we ended up doing is kind of sitting down and having some long interviews about his relationship with his dad, what happened with his dad's untimely death, getting his inheritance, and how he was trying to manage all of that. And so I think it was a few months, if I remember, of various kind of interviews. And then we put it all together. And I gave him, we were trying to be very sensitive to how we did it. And so played it for him before we released it, just to be like, hey, we're not going to give you like editorial control over like, yes, this part, no, not that part, but want to be sensitive and like let you know what's in here, and also giving you the nuke button. If you hear this and you say, hey, this is like way too personal, this is like way too intimate, you did it completely wrong, he had the option to like put the brakes on the entire thing, which luckily he didn't do. Actually, I remember in some of those listens, he was like, oh, I'm not putting the brakes on anything, I'm not trying to like line edit you, but like, here's a little bit of context for this line or that line, which I ended up making the final product much better.
Well, you talked about kind of like the challenges. Can you kind of talk about that and how they may have informed your creative choices when structuring the episode?
Yeah, totally. But the episode itself is about my friend Dean. His dad dies by suicide. He gets a massive amount of money as a result of his inheritance. And then he's really conflicted about what to do with this money, how to deal with it, and how to do things like pay off his student loans and like kind of these big money things that were hanging over him, but getting rid of the money that came from his dad kind of opened up this whole new kind of emotional can of worms. But I think the challenges with that were, yes, we talked about it in like an interview setting, but then we were friends also. So then we were just like talking about this outside of having the live mic and whatnot. And so I think the kind of the boundary between like, am I your friend talking with you and like being here to like help you through a very difficult thing, or am I like a journalist reporting on your trauma? Like those lines got very blurry. And so I think how that informed the creative choices was, I think it like really kind of lent us a new an intimacy you don't get with like a lot of sources. And I was able to like know a lot of stuff about him, but I also wanted to just make sure that I wasn't like feeling we weren't like invading something that was also like a very special part of his life. And so there are certain things that we talked about that I was like, okay, I think, maybe we're not going to include this in here because, it's not crucial for the story or for the storytelling. And we had some scenes in there that ended up getting cut where we went and talked with like a financial therapist, someone who specializes in this stuff. And I think that was like very useful for him, but it like didn't necessarily serve the overall like story that was like for other people out there. And so there was just kind of keeping the lens of like, this is about one person's relationship with their father and their relationship with this money, kind of having that be like the guiding light really helped kind of inform the final form that the story took.
Well, do you think going through that experience may have, and it might not have, but may have kind of helped inform how you move forward with maybe interviewing subjects that you're not personally close to, given that everybody's human and going through things? Like, do you think it changed just the way you approach an interview subject?
I think so. I think I realized doing a lot of that work that there are people are like going through a lot of stuff, and oftentimes they just don't have an outlet to talk about it. And so I think you're both helping listeners by like exploring a subject that maybe they're feeling, but like also with your sources, you're giving them an opportunity to get something off your chest. And so, or to get something off their chest. And I think working on that show specifically, there were a lot of times when people would say, hey, like, I've just been like wishing that there was someone that I could talk about this with. Like, this almost felt like a therapy session for me, like doing these types of interviews, which is, I think, I don't know, it is providing a service. I mean, we're not therapists. So that like it does open up a whole nother can of worms. But I think that there is helping people kind of process their emotions and talk about things and like maybe connect things into a narrative that they have been like working through, I think is really special work.
Well, I think that's also like where you get these like deeply personal like stories that are just like so relevant to so many other people, right? Out in the world. Like, I think it's really special. And it probably is a lot to have to wear that therapist hat in those meetings, that kind of, that carries a lot of weight. Do you think that has an effect on even your like producer hat, just like trying to like figure out like, where can I pull these other nuggets? Like, I can sense that they're feeling this way or that way. Can we dig into it more, as an example?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I feel like as a producer, you're often listening into the interviews, that you're like working with amazing hosts who are amazing interviewers, but you're also kind of a bit of a second set of ears to say like, hey, this really caught my attention. Maybe we should dig in deeper here. And I think you can do that when you're talking about emotions and someone's personal story, but even like when you're talking, even in like a news context where we're talking about current events or whatever, like you're still there kind of looking for those nuggets that kind of jump out, and like maybe that you're noticing that the source seems interested in, and kind of opening up that gate and going in even deeper.
Well, I think that was a great way to kind of like tie a bow on this episode. I just really thank you so much for joining us. Absolutely. And for sharing a bit more about not just this episode of This Is Uncomfortable, but then also your creative process and your career journey. I think it'll be very helpful for folks listening in. But before we go, can you please let our audience know where to find you? And where to find your work?
Sure. I mean, you can find me on Twitter right now, or X, formerly known as Twitter, Peter Balonon-Rosen. But right now I'm producing work at Today Explained, the Vox Daily News Explainer podcast. And we're putting out content every day, so you'll find some stuff that I'm working on.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Peter.
All right. Thank you, Kendall. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's episode of The Rough Draft. Be sure to rate and subscribe in order to stay up to date with the latest episodes, and visit rev.com/podcasts for even more content. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Rough Draft.